The scent of antiseptic and cheap lilies was the first thing that greeted me. It was a peasant's smell, sharp, stinging, and utterly devoid of the sandalwood and ambergris that should accompany the awakening of an emperor. I opened my eyes and the world was wrong. The ceiling was not painted with soaring phoenixes or carved from dark cedar. It was a flat, clinical white, illuminated by a humming glass tube that bled a harsh, artificial light. My body felt light, dangerously thin, and a dull ache throbbed behind my eyes. Memory surfaced like a drowning man gasping for air. The great Yan Empire. The bitter taste of poisoned wine offered by a brother I had spared too many times. The cold weight of the crown as I fell. Then, a new flood of memories, jagged, pathetic, and agonizing, slammed into my consciousness. I was no longer Xiao Jinghe, the Iron Emperor of the North. I was Xiao He, the discarded eldest son of the Xiao Group, a sprawling merchant empire of the modern age. This body was 25 years old, brittle from neglect, and currently recovering from a fainting spell, brought on by malnutrition and the calculated bullying of a woman who dared to call herself my father's wife. "He's awake." The voice was oily. I turned my head slowly. Standing by the door was a man in a sharp charcoal-colored suit. Xiao Jinghe. My father in this life. A man who sat on a throne of glass and lacked the spine to defend his own blood. Beside him stood the woman, Lin Shuran, her face a mask of elegant concern that didn't reach her predatory eyes. "Xiao He," my father said, his tone more inconvenienced than relieved. "You've caused quite a scene. Your mother's death was years ago. To still be acting out, neglecting your health, it's an embarrassment to the family name." I looked at him. I did not speak. In my past life, men had been executed for less than that tone of voice. I saw the flicker of confusion in his eyes. The old Xiao He would have flinched or wept. But I simply studied him, measuring the width of his shoulders and the weakness in his jaw. He was a man who yielded to the loudest voice in the room. He was nothing. "The doctor says you can go home tomorrow," Lin Shuran added, her hand resting with feigned sweetness on my father's arm. "We've moved your things to the attic room. The stairs will be better for your circulation, dear." The attic. A servant's quarters in a house bought with my biological mother's dowry. "Understood," I said. My voice was raspy, but it carried a cold, level resonance that made Lin Shuran's smile falter for a fraction of a second. "Leave us," I commanded. The silence that followed was heavy. My father bristled. "What did you say?" "I am tired," I said, my gaze dropping to my pale, slender hands. "If you wish for me to be an asset to your name, I require rest. Unless you prefer I collapse again in front of the board members tomorrow?" It was a gamble, a piece of modern knowledge I'd gleaned from the boy's memories. The Xiao Group was preparing for an IPO. A sickly, mistreated heir was a PR disaster. My father stiffened, cleared his throat, and turned to leave without another word. Lin Shuran lingered, her eyes narrowing as she sensed a shift in the wind before following him out. I sat up, the thin hospital gown sliding over my collarbones. I needed power. In this world, power was not held by the edge of a blade, but by the stroke of a pen and the flow of capital. I reached for the sleek black device on the bedside table, a smartphone. My fingers, guided by the muscle memory of this body, navigated to a search engine. I needed a weapon. Not a soldier but a mind. I searched for the most ruthless legal mind in the city. One name appeared repeatedly, spoken of with a mixture of terror and reverence in the financial columns. Yan Sui. The executioner in silk. Unbeaten in the high court. The man who dismantled the Wei conglomerate in 48 hours. The screen showed a photograph of a man with features carved from cold marble. He was dark-haired, his eyes sharp enough to cut glass, wearing a suit that cost more than a commoner's life. He didn't look like a man who served. He looked like a man who decided who was allowed to survive. I stared at the image. A wolf. I didn't need a servant. I needed an equal. Someone who understood that the world was a chessboard, and that mercy was merely a delay of the inevitable. I felt a ghost of a smile touch my lips, the first one in 2 lifetimes. "Wait for me, Yan Sui," I whispered into the sterile air. "The emperor has returned and he requires a counselor." The law offices of Yan and Associates did not feel like a place of business. They felt like a fortress of glass and silence. I stood in the lobby, my 25-year-old frame finally filled out by a tailored suit I had purchased with the last of my mother's hidden jewelry. I was no longer the frail boy who had woken up in that hospital bed 3 months ago. I had spent every waking hour reclaiming the discipline of my former life, training this body, consuming the intricacies of modern tax law, and mapping the vulnerabilities of the Xiao Group. "Mr. Yan is a very busy man," the receptionist said, her voice polished and impenetrable. He doesn't take walk-ins, Mr. Xiao. Especially not for family disputes. I leaned slightly over the desk. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I used the same tone I once used to command legions at the border. Tell him that I am not here to discuss my family. I am here to discuss the illegal offshore redirection of funds within the Xiao Group's subsidiary, funds that his current client, the chairman of the Bank of Commerce, is unknowingly co-signing. The woman's professional mask cracked. She picked up the phone. 5 minutes later, I was ushered into the inner sanctum. Yan Sui was exactly as the photograph suggested, yet the screen had failed to capture his gravity. He was 28, possessing a lethally composed energy that made the air in the room feel thin. He didn't rise when I entered. He simply sat behind a desk of dark obsidian, his eyes scanning a document. You have 60 seconds, Yan Sui said. His voice was a rich, cold baritone. If you're lying about the Bank of Commerce, I'll ensure you never work in this city again. If you're telling the truth, I might only charge you double my hourly rate for wasting my time. I don't lie, Mr. Yan. It is a waste of breath, I replied, walking to the chair opposite him. I didn't wait for an invitation. I sat, crossing one leg over the other with a grace that felt ancient. And I'm not here to work for anyone. I'm here to offer you a partnership. Yan Sui finally looked up. His eyes were predatory, intelligent, and entirely unimpressed. A partnership? You are the ghost heir of the Xiao family. A man whose own father treats him as a clerical error. What could you possibly offer me? The dismantling of the Xiao Group, I said, leaning forward. My father is weak and my stepmother is greedy. Between the two of them, they have left a trail of financial rot that stretches back a decade. I have the keys to the vault. You have the legal scalpel required to cut them out without killing the host. I placed a single flash drive on the obsidian desk. In there you will find the initial proof of the offshore accounts. It's enough to put Lin Shuran in prison and leave my father begging for a settlement. But I don't just want them gone. I want the empire rebuilt. Under my name. Yan Sui picked up the drive, turning it over in his long, elegant fingers. He studied me not as a client but as a puzzle. You speak like a man who has already won. Do you know who I am? I don't work with people, Mr. Xiao. I dictate the terms of their survival. Then we are alike, I said, my gaze never wavering. Because I don't submit. Not to my father, and certainly not to a lawyer, however elite he may be. A flicker of something, amusement? Challenge? Passed through Yan Sui's eyes. It was gone in an instant, replaced by a sharp, professional hunger. He stood up, and I realized he was slightly taller than me, his presence filling the space between us like a physical weight. The Xiao Group is worth billions, Yan Sui noted, stepping around the desk. He stopped just inches from me, testing my resolve. Attacking them is suicide for a man in your position. Why me? Because, I said, standing to meet him, you are the only man in this city who isn't afraid of the dark. And I am about to make this city very, very dark for my enemies. We stood in silence, two predators measuring each other. The air crackled with a tension that wasn't merely professional. It was the recognition of a shared nature. He was looking for a weakness. I was showing him a mirror. I'll review the data, Yan Sui said, his voice dropping an octave. If it's what you say it is, I'll call you. If not. I know the consequences, I interrupted. I reached out, not for a handshake but to straighten the lapel of his coat, a gesture of bold familiarity that would have gotten a man's hand severed in the great Yan. Yan Sui didn't flinch. He watched my hand, then my eyes. I'll expect that call by dawn, I said. I turned and walked out, feeling his gaze burning into my back. I didn't need to look back to know that the wolf had caught the scent of blood. The war had begun. The call came at 4:14 a.m. The shell companies in the Cayman Islands were clever. Yan Sui's voice came through the speaker, crisp and devoid of sleep. But using the mother's maiden name for the encryption key was a sentimental mistake on your stepmother's part. It took my team 3 hours to crack. I sat by the window of my small apartment, the moon casting a silver sliver across the floor. I wasn't surprised he was awake. Men like Yan Sui didn't sleep when there was a throat to be cut. It wasn't sentiment, I replied, my voice steady. It was arrogance. Lin Shuran believes no one in the Xiao household is intelligent enough to look. She views the world as a collection of fools. And you? Yan Sui asked. I could hear the faint click of a lighter, then the soft exhale of breath. What do you view the world as? A series of fortifications, I said. Some are built of stone. others of balance sheets. All of them can be breached if you find the right pressure point. Meet me at the Blue District docks. 6 a.m., he commanded, then hung up. The Blue District was a sprawling labyrinth of shipping containers and heavy machinery, the industrial heart of the city's trade. When I arrived, the sun was a bruised purple smear on the horizon. Yan Sui was leaning against a black sedan, his coat open to the biting wind. He looked less like a lawyer and more like a high-ranking enforcer. "You're late," he said, though I was exactly on time. "An emperor arrives when he intends to," I countered, walking toward him. "Why are we here, Mr. Yan? This doesn't look like a boardroom." "The Xiao Group is moving a shipment this morning," Yan Sui said, nodding toward a massive freighter. "Electronics. High-end, high-tariff. Except, according to the manifest I pulled from your flash drive, half of those containers are empty. They're being used to move liquid assets out of the country before the IPO audit hits." I narrowed my eyes. Insurance fraud and money laundering. My father is more desperate than I realized. Or more coached. Yan Sui stepped closer, his presence a cold pressure against my own. "This isn't just about the law anymore, Xiao He. If we move on this, you aren't just suing for an inheritance. You are committing to a hostile takeover that will leave your family in the dirt. Are you prepared to step over your father's career to take that seat?" I looked at the freighter, the massive metal chains groaning under the weight of the cargo. My father watched as they drained the life from my mother. He watched as they tried to break my spirit. He didn't just allow it, he facilitated it through his silence. I turned to Yan Sui, my gaze flint hard. "In my world, a king who cannot protect his own is already a corpse. He just hasn't stopped breathing yet." Yan Sui studied me for a long moment. For the first time, I saw a flicker of genuine curiosity in his expression. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the collar of my coat, mirroring the gesture I had made in his office. It wasn't an act of aggression, it was a deliberate test of my personal space. I didn't move. I didn't blink. I let him feel the absolute stillness of my resolve. "You have a strange way of speaking," Yan Sui murmured, his hand lingering near my throat. "Like you're reciting history rather than living it." "History is just a circle, Mr. Yan. The names change, but the hunger remains the same." He let his hand drop, a smirk ghosting his lips. "If we do this, we do it my way. I handle the legal siege. You handle the internal sabotage. I don't work with ghosts, Xiao He. I need you visible. I need you at the Xiao Group headquarters tomorrow, demanding your seat on the board." "I have no standing," I noted. "I own 0% of the voting shares." Yan Sui pulled a heavy vellum envelope from his coat and handed it to me. "You do now. I spent the night negotiating with your maternal grandfather's estate. It turns out he left a contingency fund in a trust that your father couldn't touch, provided the heir reached 25 and showed sufficient mental competence. I've already filed the paperwork." I opened the envelope. 8%. It wasn't a majority, but it was a foothold. A beachhead. "Why help me this much?" I asked, looking up at him. "The fees for this alone would bankrupt most men." Yan Sui stepped so close our chests nearly touched. The scent of expensive tobacco and cold air clung to him. "Because everyone else in this city is boring, Xiao He. They play for money. You're playing for blood. And I've always had a taste for it." He didn't wait for a thank you. He turned and got into the car. "Tomorrow morning. 9 a.m. Don't be late for your own coronation." As the car sped away, I felt a familiar heat rising in my chest. In the great Yan I had ruled alone. Here, in this strange metallic world, I had found a man who looked at the abyss and saw an opportunity. We were two blades being honed against the same stone. Only one question remained. When the war was over, would we turn those blades on each other, or would we remain the only two people left standing? I looked at the rising sun. The Xiao Group was about to find out that the son they discarded had returned with a wolf at his side. The headquarters of the Xiao Group was a monolith of glass and steel that pierced the gray morning sky. To the world, it was a symbol of prosperity. To me, it was a fortress built on the bones of my mother's legacy. I walked through the lobby, my footsteps echoing with a rhythmic, heavy finality. I didn't look at the security guards, I looked through them. The elevator climbed to the 42nd floor in a silence so thick it felt pressurized. When the doors opened, the executive floor was a hive of frantic activity. The IPO was days away. Panic is a scent I recognized well. It smelled like stale coffee and cold sweat. I pushed open the double oak doors of the boardroom without knocking. The room froze. My father sat at the head of the long marble table, flanked by Lin Shuran and a dozen directors. They were mid-argument, their faces flushed. Xiao He. My father's voice was a mixture of shock and immediate irritation. What is the meaning of this? This is a closed session. Security. Security is currently busy verifying the legal injunction that was served to your front desk 5 minutes ago, I said, walking to the empty chair at the far end of the table. I pulled it out and sat. Good morning, father. Stepmother. Gentlemen. Lin Shuran's eyes darted to the door, her composure fracturing. You're unwell, Xiao He. You should be in bed, not interrupting. I am remarkably well, I interrupted, leaning back. I placed the vellum envelope Yan Sui had given me onto the table. As of 8 o'clock this morning, the maternal trust of the Sheng family has been activated. I represent an 8% voting bloc. By the bylaws of this company, that entitles me to a seat, a voice, and a full inquiry into the logistics discrepancies of the Blue District shipments. The color drained from my father's face. The directors began to whisper, a low hiss of rising unease. You have no right, my father hissed, his hands trembling on the table. You know nothing of this business. I know that you are moving empty crates to inflate your valuation, I said, my voice dropping to a lethal, quiet register. I know about the Cayman accounts. And more importantly, the man currently standing in your lobby knows exactly which laws you've broken to keep them hidden. On cue, the doors opened again. Yan Sui walked in. He didn't look like a lawyer. He looked like an executioner in a three-piece suit. He carried a leather briefcase that felt like it held the weight of a dozen death warrants. He didn't look at me. He walked straight to the center of the room, his presence commandingly cold. Yan Sui, one of the elder directors, gasped. The Xiao Group hasn't retained your services. Correct, Yan Sui said, snapping open his briefcase. I represent Mr. Xiao He. And as his lead counsel, I am here to inform the board that we are filing a derivative suit for gross negligence and fiduciary fraud against the chairman and the chief operating officer. He looked at Lin Shuran. The look was so sharp, so devoid of mercy that she visibly recoiled. Mr. Yin, my father stammered, this is a family matter. We can settle this privately. There's no need to. There is no family in a court of law, Mr. Xiao, Yan Sui said, his voice a smooth, terrifying rasp. There are only predators and prey. Currently you are the latter. For the next hour I watched a master at work. Yan Sui didn't shout. He dismantled them with precision, citing statutes and transaction codes as if he were reciting poetry. He trapped them in their own lies, watching with clinical interest as they turned on one another. I sat in silence, observing. This was the modern battlefield. No blood was spilled, but lives were being ended all the same. Twice, Yan Sui's eyes met mine across the table. It wasn't a look of reassurance, it was a challenge. Are you watching? He seemed to ask. Is this enough for you? By the end of the session, the board had voted to suspend my father's executive powers pending an internal audit. Lin Shuran was escorted out by the company's own security, her face twisted in a silent, ugly scream of fury. As the room cleared, only Yan Sui and I remained. The air smelled of ozone and victory. You were quiet, Yan Sui said, leaning against the marble table. He began to pack his documents, his movements slow and deliberate. Most men in your position would have wanted to twist the knife personally. An emperor does not need to speak when his general is doing his job, I said, standing up. I walked toward him, the distance between us closing until I could feel the heat radiating from his body. Besides, watching you work was illuminating. Yan Sui stopped what he was doing. He looked down at me, his dark eyes searching mine. Illuminating? Or entertaining? Both, I admitted. I reached out and traced the line of his jaw with the back of my hand, a brief, daring touch. You have a very particular way of destroying people, Yan Sui. It's almost beautiful. Yan Sui grabbed my wrist. His grip was firm, a silent assertion of his own power. He didn't pull away, instead he stepped closer, his shadow falling over me. Don't mistake me for a tool, Xiao he warned, his voice low and dangerous. I am not your general. I am your partner. And if you play with fire, you should expect to get burned. I was born in the fire, I whispered, my heart hammering against my ribs, not with fear but with a thrill I hadn't felt in centuries. I find I rather like the heat. Yan Sui let go of my wrist, but his gaze lingered on my lips for a fraction of a second before he turned away. The audit begins at dawn, he said, his tone returning to its professional chill. Be ready. They'll try to kill the king before he can wear the crown. Let them try, I said to his retreating back. As I stood alone in the boardroom, I looked out at the city. It was no longer a foreign land. It was my territory. And for the first time, I realized I didn't just want the empire. I wanted the man who was helping me take it. The victory in the boardroom was a surgical strike, but surgery always leaves a wound. As I descended to the basement parking lot, the air felt heavy, as if the building itself were exhaling its resentment. My father was a coward, but a cornered coward is capable of a mindless, panicked violence that even a strategist can overlook. I reached my car, but before I could unlock it, the hair on my neck stood up. The silence of the concrete cavern was too perfect. You really think you can just walk in and take it? My half-brother, Xiao Jinghe, stepped from behind a pillar. At 22, he was the physical embodiment of our father's indulgence. Expensive clothes, a soft jawline, and eyes clouded by a lifetime of being told he was the center of the world. In his hand he gripped a heavy tire iron, his knuckles white. "Chin," I said, my voice bored. I didn't reach for a weapon. I didn't have one. I simply stood with my hands behind my back, the posture of a man watching a child throw a tantrum. "Go home. You're out of your depth. You're a freak," he spat, stepping closer. "You were supposed to stay in the hospital. You were supposed to die like your mother. My mom made sure of it." He stopped, realizing he'd said too much, then roared and swung the iron bar. I didn't flinch. I had survived assassins in the dark of the imperial palace. A pampered boy with a tool was nothing. I stepped into his guard, the movement fluid and calculated. I caught his wrist, twisting the joint with a sickening pop, and slammed my palm into his solar plexus. He crumpled, gasping for air. I stood over him, looking down with a cold, detached curiosity. "Your mother was sloppy," I whispered. "And you are weak." "That's enough, Xiao He." I turned. Yan Sui was standing 10 feet away, leaning against his sedan. He had seen everything. He didn't look shocked or disgusted. He looked like he was evaluating my technique. "He was a threat," I said, my pulse finally beginning to settle. "He was an amateur," Yan Sui countered, walking over. He looked down at my gasping half-brother with the same indifference one might show a crushed insect. "But amateurs are the ones who get you killed because they don't follow the rules of the game. Get in the car." "I have my own." "Get the car." His tone left no room for the emperor to argue. I followed him. The drive was silent. The city lights blurred into long, neon streaks against the rain-slicked glass. We didn't go to my apartment. We headed toward the heights of the city, where the buildings were older, made of stone and history. Yan Sui's penthouse was a study in minimalism, steel, glass, and shadows. He walked to the bar, poured 2 fingers of amber liquid, and handed it to me. "Drink it," he ordered. I took a sip. It burned, a sharp, clean heat. "You're acting as if I'm the one who was attacked." "You were," Yan Sui said. He moved into my space, his presence suddenly overwhelming in the quiet of the room. He reached out, his thumb brushing over a small cut on my cheek I hadn't even noticed. "You're bleeding." The touch was electric. In the boardroom we were titans. Here, in the dim light of his living room, we were just 2 men. I looked up at him, my breath hitching. The analytical lawyer was gone, replaced by something darker, hungrier. "I've had worse," I said softly. "I don't doubt it," Yan Sui murmured. His hand didn't move away. Instead, his fingers slid into my hair, tilting my head back. "Who are you, Xiao He? You fight like a soldier and talk like a god. You look at a billion-dollar company like it's a toy." "I am the man you chose to partner with," I replied. I reached up, my hand resting on his chest, feeling the steady, powerful thrum of his heart. "Does it matter where I came from, as long as we both get what we want?" Yan Sui's eyes darkened. "And what do you think I want?" "The same thing I do," I said, stepping closer until there was no air left between us. "To be the only ones left standing when the world burns." He didn't answer with words. He leaned down, his lips ghosting over mine, a silent challenge. I didn't pull away. I leaned into the contact, my hands gripping the lapels of his suit. But he stopped. He pulled back just an inch, his forehead resting against mine. "You're a dangerous man, Xiao He. And you're a coward if you're afraid of danger," I whispered. He let out a short, dark laugh and stepped away, though his gaze remained anchored to mine. "Stay here tonight. My security is better than yours, and your family is currently in a state of unpredictable desperation. I don't take charity, Mr. Yan. It's not charity, he said, turning to walk toward his bedroom. It's protecting an asset. There's a guest room down the hall. Try not to plot any more murders until morning. I watched him go, the ghost of his touch still burning on my skin. I didn't go to the guest room. I sat by the window watching the city below. For the first time in 2 lives, the silence didn't feel like a vacuum. It felt like a promise. We were partners in a war, but as I felt the weight of the day settle into my bones, I realized the most dangerous battle wouldn't be in the courtroom. It would be in the quiet moments between us, where the masks slipped and the equals finally met. I woke before the sun, my internal clock still tuned to the rhythm of palace life where the dawn heralded either a decree or a decapitation. The guest room was cold, smelling of rain and Yan Sui's expensive, metallic cologne. I didn't stay in bed. I walked out into the main living area, my bare feet silent on the polished concrete. The floor-to-ceiling windows revealed a city draped in fog, the skyscrapers looking like jagged teeth rising from a gray sea. Yan Sui was already there. He was standing by the window, a cup of black coffee in his hand, wearing nothing but charcoal silk trousers. The muscles of his back were a map of tension and discipline. "You move like a ghost," he said without turning. "And you sleep like a man who expects to be haunted," I replied, leaning against the doorframe. He turned then, his eyes tracing the line of my throat before settling on my face. The sharpness of the previous night's confrontation had been replaced by a heavy, domestic stillness. "The audit results are coming in. Your stepmother didn't just steal, she gutted the pension funds of the subsidiary employees to cover her gambling debts in Macau." I felt a cold flash of satisfaction. Then she hasn't just committed fraud. She's committed social suicide. The board won't just fire her, they'll sacrifice her to save their own reputations. "Calculated as always," Yan Sui murmured. He walked toward me, setting his coffee down on a low table. He stopped just inches away, the heat from his body cutting through the morning chill. "But there's a problem. Your father has vanished." I frowned. "He doesn't have the stomach for a flight. He's a man of comfort." "He's a man of panic," Yan Sui corrected. He reached out, his hand hovering near my waist before he settled it firmly on the small of my back. He pulled me slightly closer, not an aggressive move but a steadying one. "I have people looking. But until he's found, you stay with me. I don't care about your pride, Xiao He. I care about the case." "The case?" I repeated, a dry smile touching my lips. "Is that all this is, counselor?" Yan Sui's gaze dropped to my mouth. The air between us grew thick, charged with the unspoken recognition of the night before. "You are an infuriating client," he whispered. He didn't wait for a rebuttal. He leaned in, but instead of a kiss, he pressed his forehead against mine. It was a gesture of profound, silent intimacy, an admission of a shared burden that felt heavier than any crown I had ever worn. We stood like that for a long time, 2 predators resting in the eye of the storm. "I need to go to the office," I said eventually, my voice a breath against his skin. "If I'm not there, the board will think I'm afraid." "You don't go alone," Yan Sui said, his hand tightening on my back for a brief second before he let go. "We go together. As equals." The lobby of the Xiao Group was a gauntlet. Reporters had gathered like vultures, sensing the rot within the empire. Yan Sui walked a half-step behind me, his presence a silent warning to anyone who dared to approach. As we entered the executive elevator, a hand caught the door. Lin Shuren stood there, her hair disheveled, her expensive silk blouse stained. She looked like a woman who had seen the end of the world. "You," she hissed, looking at me. "You did this. You broke your father." "He was already broken," I said, my voice as cold as a winter tomb. "I simply stopped pretending he was whole." "You'll never be one of them," she spat as the doors began to close. "You're just a ghost, Xiao He. A ghost in a dead woman's skin." The elevator ascended. I felt a tremor in my hands, not fear, but a residual echo of the boy who had been bullied by this woman for years. Suddenly, a warm, heavy weight covered my hand. Yan Sui had interlaced his fingers with mine. He didn't look at me, he kept his eyes on the floor numbers as they climbed. But his grip was unshakable. "She's a dying animal," he said quietly. "Don't let her blood stain your suit." I squeezed his hand back, the tension in my chest easing. The emperor had never had a protector. I found the sensation addictive. When we reached the top floor, the board was waiting. But they weren't looking at the documents. They were looking at the giant screen in the center of the room. News footage showed a car pulled from the river. My father's car. The room went silent. I felt Yan Sui's hand slip away, returning to a professional distance, but I could still feel the phantom warmth of his skin. "It seems," I said, walking to the head of the table and taking the chair that had been my father's, "that the audit can be concluded. We are moving to the restructuring phase." I looked at Yan Sui. He stood by the door, his arms crossed, a dark, prideful look in his eyes. The world feared us. But in that moment, as the chaos of the Xiao Empire crumbled around us, I knew that the only thing that mattered was the man standing at the edge of the room, waiting for the smoke to clear so we could walk through it together. The funeral was a performance and I was the lead actor. My father had survived the plunge into the river, a pathetic, failed attempt at a dramatic exit that had resulted in nothing more than a broken leg and a shattered reputation. He was currently confined to a private medical wing, guarded not by nurses, but by Yan Sui's hand-picked security. The funeral today was for his career, held in the hushed, carpeted rooms of a private club where the city's elite gathered to bury their own before the stench of scandal reached the press. I stood by the tall, arched windows, watching the rain wash over the city. I wore black, a suit of such fine wool it felt like a second skin. "You look like a man who has finally come home," a voice drawled behind me. I didn't need to turn. The scent of cedar and expensive smoke preceded him. Yan Sui stepped up beside me, his shoulder nearly brushing mine. He was dressed in a charcoal suit that emphasized the predatory leanness of his frame. In public we were a study in professional distance, but the air between us was always taut, a wire stretched to the breaking point. "I am home," I said, my voice low. "Power is the only home I've ever recognized. Everything else is just a temporary shelter." Yan Sui turned his head, his sharp eyes scanning my profile. "Is that why you're pushing the merger through tonight? Most men would wait for the mourning period to end, even if the person they're mourning is still breathing. Mourning is a luxury for those who don't have enemies at their gates," I countered. I looked at him, catching his gaze. "My half-siblings are already talking to the press. Lin Shuran is trying to sell her shares to a rival conglomerate. If I don't consolidate the board tonight, I'll be king of a graveyard." Yan Sui's lips curved into a thin, dangerous smile. "Then it's a good thing I brought the shovels." He reached into his inner pocket and pulled out a leather-bound folder. The proxy votes from the minority shareholders. I spent the last 6 hours reminding them that a dead empire pays no dividends, but a reorganized one under your leadership is a gold mine. They've signed. I took the folder, my fingers brushing his. The contact was brief, but it sent a jolt of electricity through me that I carefully masked. "You've been busy, counselor. I told you, Xiao He. I have a taste for blood. And I've grown quite fond of yours." The boardroom battle that followed was not a massacre, it was an execution. One by one, the directors who had once sneered at the neglected son were forced to look at the numbers. The evidence of my father's incompetence was laid bare, documented with the cold precision that was Yan Sui's trademark. By the time the clock struck midnight, I had been named acting chairman with a 90% mandate. As the directors scurried out, their faces pale under the fluorescent lights, the silence that followed was deafening. I sat at the head of the table, the weight of the company finally resting on my shoulders. It felt familiar. It felt right. Yan Sui stayed. He walked to the bar in the corner of the room and poured 2 glasses of vintage scotch. He walked back and set one in front of me, but he didn't sit. He stood behind me, his hands resting on the back of my leather chair. "The world is going to hate you tomorrow," he murmured. "They'll call you the son who betrayed his father. The usurper." "Let them," I said, taking a slow sip of the scotch. "The world is governed by those who act, not those who whisper from the sidelines." I felt the weight of his hands shift. He didn't pull away, instead he leaned down, his chest pressing against my back. I could feel the steady rhythmic beat of his heart through his shirt. It was a grounding force, an anchor in the swirling chaos of my own ambition. "And what about us, Xiao He?" His voice was a ghost of a sound against my ear. "The deal was to get you the chair. The chair is yours. My contract is technically fulfilled." I stood up slowly, turning within the circle of his arms. We were alone in the darkened boardroom, the city lights reflecting in the glass like fallen stars. I reached up, my hand settling on his neck, my thumb tracing the sharp line of his jaw. A contract is a legal document, Sui, I said, using his name without the title for the first time. It doesn't dictate where I want you to be when the lights go out. Yan Sui's eyes darkened, the cold lawyer replaced by something far more primal. He didn't move to kiss me. He simply stood there, accepting the touch, his own hands coming up to rest on my waist. The dominance we both projected to the world flickered, replaced by a raw, mutual recognition. I told you, he whispered, I don't stand beside men who lose. Then you're exactly where you belong, I replied. I pulled him closer, the distance between us vanishing. For the first time since I had woken up in this strange modern world, I wasn't thinking about revenge or stock prices. I was thinking about the heat of the man in my arms and the terrifying, beautiful realization that I no longer wanted to rule alone. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the glass walls, the emperor had found his equal. And the war was only just beginning. The transition of power was not a peaceful handover, it was a siege. While the ink on the board's resolution was still drying, the counterattacks began. My half-siblings had filed for a preliminary injunction to freeze my voting shares, and the press had been leaked a series of doctored medical reports claiming I was mentally unstable, a lingering effect of my recent hospitalization. I stood in the center of my new office, the morning sun cutting through the glass like a blade. I didn't look at the headlines on the desk. I was looking at the man sitting on the edge of the mahogany table, casually flipping through a thick legal brief. They're getting desperate, Yan Sui said, not looking up. The mental instability angle is a classic move for those who can't win on merit. It's messy, loud, and ultimately, a sign that they have nothing else. It's an insult, I said, my voice tight. In my past life, questioning an emperor's mind was a death sentence. To have it splashed across digital screens for the masses to consume felt like a physical blow to my pride. I want them silenced, Sui. Not just refuted. I want the source of the leak dismantled. Yan Sui finally looked up. His expression was unreadable, a wall of professional calm that grated against my simmering fury. If we move too aggressively, we validate their narrative. A sane man doesn't burn down a news outlet for a headline. A sane man wins the case and sues for libel afterward. I am not a sane man by their definition. I stepped toward him, my shadow falling over the pages he was reading. I am a man who has reclaimed a life that was stolen. I don't have the patience for the slow wheels of your modern justice. Yan Sui stood up slowly. The height difference was marginal, but his presence seemed to expand, meeting my aggression with a cold, immovable weight. Then you don't need a lawyer. You need a thug. Is that what you think I am? The air in the room shifted. This was the clash of two dominant forces. The emperor used to absolute decree and the elite who bowed to no one. We stood chest to chest, the silence between us vibrating with a sudden, sharp hostility. I think you are the only person who can keep up with me, I hissed. But don't forget who brought you into this room. Yan Sui's eyes flashed with a dangerous light. He reached out, his hand moving so fast I barely saw it, and gripped the back of my neck. He didn't squeeze, but the pressure was a clear assertion of power. He leaned in until his lips were inches from my ear. I wasn't brought anywhere, Xiao He. I walked in because I chose to. And I can walk out just as easily. If you want to play the tyrant, do it with your board of directors. But with me? You are an equal or you are alone. I froze. No one had spoken to me like that in 2 lifetimes. The audacity of it should have enraged me, but instead I felt a strange, thrilling shift in my chest. The isolation of the throne was a heavy burden. To be challenged so brazenly was a shock that felt like life. I let out a slow, jagged breath, my own hand coming up to rest on his forearm. The muscles were like iron beneath the silk of his sleeve. You're overstepping, counselor. I'm keeping you alive, he countered, though his grip softened, his thumb beginning to trace the sensitive skin just below my ear. The anger didn't vanish, but it transformed into something else, a dark, mutual heat. We were still in the office, still surrounded by the symbols of the empire we were fighting for, but the professional distance was non-existent. Prove it, I whispered. Win this and I'll admit you were right. Yan Sui pulled back just enough to look me in the eye. A smirk, cruel, confident, and utterly devastating, tugged at the corner of his mouth. I don't need your admission. I need your focus. Stay in this room. Don't talk to the press. Let me handle the wolves. He let go of my neck, the absence of his touch feeling like a sudden cold. He picked up his briefcase and headed for the door. At the threshold he stopped and looked back. And Xiao He? Lock the door. I don't want anyone else seeing you look this unraveled. As the door clicked shut, I sank into my chair. My heart was racing. I had won an empire, but I was beginning to realize that the man who helped me take it was the far more dangerous acquisition. I reached up and touched the spot on my neck where his hand had been. The price of his loyalty wasn't money. It was the surrender of my absolute control. And for the first time I found myself willing to pay it. The headlines didn't stop. By the following morning, the medical reports had been analyzed by every tabloid psychiatrist in the country. They called it a dissociative break, a young man crushed by the weight of a legacy he wasn't fit to carry. My half-siblings were playing the role of the grieving, concerned kin to perfection, using the press to advocate for a legal guardianship that would effectively strip me of my voting rights and return the Xiao Group to their fumbling hands. I stayed in the penthouse as ordered. The silence was a cage. In the Great Yin, I would have had the tongues of the gossips removed before the sun set. Here, I paced the length of my living room watching the digital ticker of the stock market bleed red. "You're pacing again," Yan Sui said. I hadn't heard him enter. He was standing by the kitchen island, his tie discarded and his sleeves rolled up. He looked remarkably grounded for a man whose client was being branded a lunatic. He placed a glass of water and a small white pill on the counter. "What is that?" I asked, my voice sharp with suspicion. "A sedative. Mild. You haven't slept in 48 hours and your eyes look like you're ready to declare war on the furniture." He moved into my path, stopping my movement with the sheer gravity of his presence. "The competency hearing is at 10 a.m. tomorrow. If you walk into that courtroom looking like a man on the edge of a breakdown, we lose." I looked at the pill, then back at him. The insult of it burned. "You want me drugged? You want me to play the part of a compliant patient for the sake of your legal strategy?" "I want you to win," Yan Sui hissed. He stepped closer, his hand coming up to rest on my chest, right over my racing heart. "Your pride is a crown, Xiao He, but right now it's a noose. They aren't looking for a king. They're looking for a crack in the porcelain. If you give them even a second of that imperial rage, they will lock you in a gilded room for the rest of your life." I grabbed his wrist, my fingers digging into the pulse point. The air between us crackled, the same dominant friction that had nearly unraveled us in the office. "And if I lose myself to your strategy, what is left? A puppet? A shadow?" "You won't lose yourself," he murmured, his voice dropping to that low, hypnotic rasp that always managed to settle the static in my brain. "Because I'll be the one holding the leash. Do you trust me, or were those just words in the office?" The silence stretched. I studied his face, the cold, analytical precision of his eyes, and the underlying warmth he only showed when the doors were locked. I realized then that the instability they accused me of was actually my greatest strength. I was the only one who knew that the world was a game of masks. And Yan Sui was the only one who knew the man behind mine. I took the pill. I didn't use the water. I swallowed it dry, my eyes locked on his. "If I wake up and the empire is gone, I will kill you myself, Sui." "Fair enough," he replied, a shadow of that devastating smirk appearing. He didn't leave. He stayed as the medication began to pull the world into a soft, blurry haze. He led me to the bedroom, his touch professional yet lingering. When I lay down, the weight of the day finally began to lift. Just as sleep took me, I felt the bed shift. Yan Sui didn't leave for his own home. He sat at the foot of the bed, the glow of his laptop the only light in the room. He was guarding my sanity while I couldn't. The courtroom was a tomb of mahogany and cold air. My stepmother sat in the front row, a black veil draped over her face as if she were already mourning my freedom. Across the aisle, my half-siblings whispered to a legal team that looked like a pack of vultures. When the judge called my name, the room went silent. "Mr. Xiao," the judge began, peering over his spectacles. "The evidence provided suggests a pattern of erratic behavior and speech. You've made references to a past life and imperial decrees during your private recovery. How do you respond?" I felt the familiar heat of indignation rise in my throat, but then I felt a sharp, grounding pressure on my foot beneath the table. Yan Sui didn't look at me, but his presence was a steadying anchor. "I respond with the truth, Your Honor. I said, my voice clear, modern, and utterly devoid of the archaic flourishes I usually preferred. I was a young man who suffered a traumatic loss and a near-death experience. My speech was a coping mechanism, a way to distance myself from a family that had abandoned me. If ambition and a desire for corporate justice are symptoms of madness, then every CEO in this city belongs in a ward. For the next 3 hours, I watched Yan Sui perform a masterpiece of legal slaughter. He didn't just defend my sanity, he put my family on trial. He presented the doctored nature of the medical leaks and a digital ledger detailing Lin Shuren's staggering gambling debts in Macau, millions siphoned from subsidiary accounts and offshore reserves to satisfy a high-stakes addiction she had hidden for years. But he was only warming up. Your Honor, Yan Sui said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal resonance that signaled the kill. While investigating the attempt to freeze my client's assets, we uncovered the reason for the stepmother's desperation. It wasn't just greed, it was a cover-up for a crime that has gone unpunished for 10 years. He placed a final heavy folder on the judge's bench. It contained the missing hospital logs, records my father had suppressed to avoid a scandal, and a sworn affidavit from a former private nurse who had been paid to disappear. The paper trail was undeniable, a series of untraceable payments from Lin Shuren's private accounts to the nurse, coinciding exactly with the accidental respiratory failure that had claimed my mother's life. The room erupted. Lin Shuren's composure didn't just crack, it shattered. Her elegant veil slipped as she shrieked at the judge, a cornered animal finally caught in a trap of her own making. She tried to bolt for the exit, her silk heels clicking frantically against the hardwood, but the doors were already guarded. 2 plainclothes officers stepped forward, the metallic clack of handcuffs echoing through the chamber. My father sat paralyzed, his face a mask of cowardice as he realized that by protecting her, he had signed his own professional death warrant. He watched in silence as they read her the rights she had so often bypassed for others, the cold reality of a first-degree murder charge finally settling over the room. When the judge finally hammered the gavel, dismissing the guardianship petition and ordering the immediate arrest of Lin Shuren on charges of murder and grand larceny, the sound was like the closing of a tomb for my enemies. I stood as the courtroom cleared. The Xiao Group was no longer a contested prize, it was mine, absolute and untouchable. The legal warfare had stripped my father of his remaining authority, leaving me as the sole architect of the family's future. We didn't wait for the press. We slipped through a back exit into the rain-slicked afternoon. Inside the car, the professional distance finally collapsed. I leaned back against the leather, the adrenaline leaving me in a sudden, cold rush. You were perfect, Yan Sui said. He wasn't looking at the road. He was looking at me, his eyes filled with a dark, prideful heat. I hated every second of it, I admitted, turning my head to meet his gaze. I felt small. You weren't small. You were disciplined. He reached across the console, his hands sliding into my hair, pulling me toward him. That was the most dominant thing I've ever seen you do. He kissed me then, a hard, desperate collision that tasted of victory and the lingering tension of the last 48 hours. It wasn't a soft touch, it was the seal on a partnership that had transcended business and revenge. The Xiao Group was mine. The enemies were broken. But as we drove toward the horizon of a city that finally belonged to me, I realized that the crown wasn't the goal anymore. The goal was the man beside me. The world would always fear the executioner lawyer and the ruthless heir. They would see the power, the money, and the cold strategic brilliance. They would never see the way he held me in the dark, or the way I leaned into him when the mask became too heavy. In the quiet, away from everyone and the noise of the world, we only belonged to each other.